There exists a pattern in the depths of the psyche that operates with such precision, such uncanny timing, that to call it mere coincidence would be to deny the intelligence of the unconscious itself. When you stand at the threshold of transformation, when something inside you has begun to shift in ways you cannot yet name, certain people begin to disappear from your life. Not slowly, not gradually, but with a swiftness that feels like cruelty. You may have noticed this already. Relationships that seemed unshakable suddenly dissolve. People you trusted become strangers. Connections you believed were permanent reveal themselves as temporary. And in the confusion of these losses, you ask yourself what you did wrong. But here is what I discovered through years of studying this phenomenon. You did nothing wrong. The psyche is preparing you for something your current relationships cannot survive. According to my research into the process of individuation, the self operates with an intelligence that far exceeds conscious understanding. It knows what must fall away before new consciousness can emerge. It recognizes, long before you do, which presences in your life will obstruct the transformation attempting to occur. And so it begins a process of removal that feels to the conscious mind like abandonment. But this is not abandonment, this is protection. The unconscious, in its wisdom, clears the field before the breakthrough arrives. It removes obstacles you cannot yet perceive as obstacles. It separates you from energies that would drain the very life force your transformation requires. What I am about to reveal will challenge everything you have been told about loyalty, about friendship, about who belongs in your life during periods of growth. You have been taught that true relationships survive all changes, that real love remains constant through every evolution. But depth psychology reveals something different. It shows that certain relationships exist precisely to serve a former version of yourself. And when that self begins to die, those relationships must die with it. Not because they were false, not because anyone failed, but because the psychological structure supporting them has fundamentally altered. The person you are becoming cannot be held by the same connections that held who you were. And this is where the unconscious begins its work of necessary removal. Through years of studying the unconscious, one phenomenon appeared with such regularity that I came to recognize it as a law of psychological transformation. Before the self can emerge into new consciousness, certain presences must withdraw. Not randomly, not arbitrarily, but according to a pattern so precise, so archetypal, that it reveals itself across cultures, across time periods, across every documented case of genuine individuation. The psyche knows what it is doing, even when you do not, even when the losses feel like punishment. The mechanism at work is this. Transformation requires energy, enormous amounts of psychic energy, and certain relationships function as drains on that energy in ways you cannot consciously detect. The unconscious detects them, and it acts. What you experience as abandonment is actually the psyche's protection mechanism, and these three types of people are not removed by cruelty but by necessity. They are removed because their continued presence would prevent the very breakthrough you are approaching. Not because they are evil, not because they wish you harm, but because the psychological dynamics between you and them create an energetic structure that locks you into patterns of the past, and the future attempting to emerge cannot coexist with those patterns. So the unconscious does what consciousness cannot. It severs the connections that must be severed. It withdraws the presences that must withdraw. And it leaves you standing alone in a space that feels like desolation, but is actually preparation. You feel it, do you not? This strange combination of grief and relief, the sadness of loss mixed with an inexplicable sense of liberation. That is the self speaking. That is the deeper intelligence within you confirming what consciousness resists. These people had to go, not because you failed them, but because you are becoming someone they cannot accompany. And now, having established this foundation, we must examine the three specific types the psyche removes before breakthrough can occur. These are not arbitrary categories. These are archetypal patterns that emerge from the collective unconscious itself, and once you recognize them, you will see them operating in your own life with startling clarity. The first person removed is the one who reflects back to you the identity you are transcending. This is perhaps the most painful removal because this person knew you when. They carry in their perception of you a crystallized image of who you were, your struggles, your limitations, your former way of being in the world, and every time you interact with them, that old self is unconsciously enforced. Not through malice, not through conscious intention, but through the simple mechanism of projection and reflection. They see you as you were, and in their seeing, they call that former self back into existence. The psyche operates through a principle I came to call mutual projection. In relationship, we do not encounter the other person as they truly are. We encounter our projected image of them, and they encounter their projected image of us. Over time, these projections become rigid. They become the foundation of the relationship itself. And when one person begins to change fundamentally, when the actual self no longer matches the projected image, a tension emerges that cannot be resolved. The other person, unconsciously, attempts to restore the familiar image. They remind you of how you used to be. They reference old patterns. They subtly, or not so subtly, resist the new consciousness emerging in you. This is not conscious sabotage. This is the psyche's attempt to maintain stability, to preserve the known world. But your transformation requires the destruction of that known world. It requires you to become unrecognizable to those who knew you before. And so the unconscious, recognizing this incompatibility, begins to create distance. Conversations become strained, misunderstandings multiply. What once felt easy now feels effortful, and eventually, through a series of events that feel almost orchestrated, the connection dissolves. They drift away, or you drift away, and what remains is a strange emptiness where that relationship used to be. But here is what the conscious mind cannot see: that emptiness is necessary. It is the space in which your new self can take form without the constant gravitational pull of your former identity. Every time that person looked at you and saw who you used to be, they were anchoring you to a past that must be released. Their removal is not punishment. It is liberation. The psyche knows you cannot become who you are meant to be while remaining tethered to reflections of who you were. And so it cuts the tether, swiftly, completely, and leaves you free to emerge. The second presence that withdraws is far more subtle, for this person loves you but cannot bear your transformation. They do not wish you harm. They may genuinely want your happiness, but your growth triggers something unbearable in their own psyche, the recognition of their own unlived life. What emerged from my analytical work was this understanding. We are most threatened not by those who are fundamentally different from us, but by those who are becoming what we refuse to become. Your transformation holds up a mirror to their stagnation. Your courage illuminates their fear. And the unconscious, unable to tolerate this reflection, must either join you in growth or reject you entirely. Most often, it chooses rejection. Not through dramatic confrontation, but through a slow withdrawal of energy. They become critical of your changes. They express concern that feels like care, but functions as control. They remind you of risks, of responsibilities, of all the reasons you should remain as you were. And beneath these rational objections lies the deeper truth. Your evolution is unbearable to them because it reveals the evolution they denied themselves. The shadow mechanism at work here is projection. They project onto you their own rejected potential, and then they must destroy it in you to avoid confronting it in themselves. What became clear through decades of observation is that transformation is threatening to the collective. The group psyche functions through conformity, through shared agreements about what is possible and what is not. When one member begins to transcend those agreements, the collective unconscious perceives a threat to its stability, and it responds with pressure to return to conformity. This pressure manifests through the people closest to you, family members who suddenly become concerned about your choices, friends who question your judgment, partners who feel abandoned by your growth. They are not consciously trying to hold you back. They are unconsciously serving the collective's need for stability. But your individuation requires you to break from the collective. It requires you to become, in Jung's terms, yourself. Not the self the group needs you to be, but the self your psyche is demanding you become. And this process is fundamentally lonely. It must be, because you cannot individuate while remaining merged with the collective consciousness. You must separate. You must stand alone. And the people who love you from within the collective perspective will experience your separation as betrayal. Not because you betrayed them, but because you betrayed the unspoken agreement to remain as you were, to stay within the boundaries the collective finds acceptable. And so the psyche removes them, not through your conscious choice, though you may feel you are making choices, but through a deeper mechanism that operates beneath awareness. Suddenly, these relationships feel suffocating. Conversations that used to nourish you now drain you. Their presence, which once brought comfort, now brings a subtle but persistent unease. And gradually, through misunderstandings that seem to arise from nowhere, through conflicts that feel disproportionate to their apparent cause, the connection breaks. They withdraw, or you withdraw, and what remains is the solitude required for genuine transformation. This solitude is not punishment, it is preparation. The psyche is creating the conditions necessary for breakthrough. It is removing the voices that would drown out the voice of the self. It is clearing the space in which new consciousness can emerge without immediate opposition. And though this clearing feels like abandonment, it is actually the most profound form of protection the unconscious can offer. It is protecting your becoming from those who, despite their love, cannot witness it without trying to prevent it. The third type, removed before breakthrough, operates through a mechanism the unconscious recognizes as dangerous. They feed on the very life force your transformation requires. These are the individuals who exist in a state of perpetual crisis, perpetual need, perpetual demand for your energy and attention. In their presence, you feel drained. After conversations with them, you require hours or days to recover. They do not give, they only take. And what they take is precisely the psychic energy your transformation needs to complete itself. From the perspective of individuation, energy is not unlimited. The psyche has only so much vitality available at any given time, and during periods of profound transformation, that energy is needed internally. It is needed for the death of the old self and the birth of the new. It is needed for the integration of shadow material, for the confrontation with the unconscious, for the sustained attention required to hear what the self is attempting to communicate. When that energy is constantly drained by external demands, the transformation cannot occur. The psyche recognizes this, and it responds by making these draining relationships suddenly intolerable. What depth psychology reveals is that these energy vampires are not conscious of what they do. They operate from their own unconscious wounding, their own unmet needs, their own refusal to turn inward and do the work of individuation. And so they turn outward, seeking in others what can only be found within. They project onto you the role of savior, healer, parent, provider. Whatever role allows them to avoid their own depths. And if you accept that role, if you continue to give what they demand, your transformation will be delayed indefinitely. The unconscious knows this, and it will not allow the delay to continue. I recall a person who came to me in a state of profound confusion. Every relationship in her life had suddenly deteriorated. Friends stopped calling. Family members became distant. A partner of many years had left without clear explanation. She could not understand what she had done to deserve this abandonment. But as we explored her psyche, what emerged was striking. She was on the verge of a major creative breakthrough. Her unconscious had been preparing for months to birth a work of genuine originality. But every time the creative energy began to rise, she would receive a phone call, a crisis. Someone needed her immediately, and she would give the energy that was meant for creation to managing someone else's chaos instead. The psyche had tried subtle corrections. She would feel resentful after these interactions. She would notice her creative work suffering. But she overrode these signals, believing loyalty required self-sacrifice. And so the unconscious escalated. It removed the sources of drain entirely, not through her conscious choice, but through a series of events that felt beyond her control. The friend's crisis suddenly resolved itself. The family member found another source of support. The partner left. And in the silence that followed, in the space emptied of these demands, her creative breakthrough finally occurred. What she experienced as loss was actually the psyche clearing the way for birth. This is the pattern. The unconscious protects the transformation by removing those who drain the energy required for its completion, and it does so with a ruthlessness that the conscious mind finds disturbing. Because consciousness values relationship, consciousness fears solitude, consciousness believes that goodness means availability, that love means perpetual giving. But the self knows differently. The self knows that during certain sacred periods, you must withdraw from external demands entirely. You must become temporarily unavailable. Not because you are selfish, but because you are gestating something that requires all of you. And these people, these energy vampires, they cannot tolerate your withdrawal. Your refusal to engage with their drama triggers their abandonment wounds. Your boundary setting feels like rejection. And so they escalate, demanding more, creating bigger crises, attempting to pull you back into the familiar role. But the psyche will not be fooled. It recognizes the manipulation even when consciousness does not. And it responds by making the connection impossible to maintain. You find yourself unable to answer their calls, unable to engage with their stories, unable to give what you once gave so freely, and they interpret this as cruelty. But it is not cruelty. It is the self protecting its own emergence. When you understand this removal not as punishment, but as preparation, something shifts in how you experience the loneliness of growth. The aloneness stops feeling like abandonment and begins to feel like sanctuary. The silence stops feeling like emptiness and begins to feel like possibility. You recognize that the psyche has not taken people from you arbitrarily. It has removed precisely those presences that would prevent your breakthrough. The mirror of your former self, whose reflection kept you locked in old identity. The one who loved you but could not bear your transformation, whose unconscious resistance would have slowly suffocated your growth. The energy vampire, whose constant demands would have drained the vitality your new self requires. These removals are not random, they are surgical, they are precise, and they serve a purpose that consciousness cannot yet see, but will understand in retrospect. Because here is what happens after the removal, after the loneliness, after the apparent abandonment, you break through. The transformation that was struggling to occur finally completes itself. The new consciousness emerges, and with it comes a different quality of relationship, a different caliber of connection. The people who enter your life after breakthrough are not reflections of your past. They are companions for your future. They do not drain you. They energize you. They do not resist your growth. They celebrate it. But these new connections could not have entered while the old ones remained. The psyche knows this. It knows you cannot fill a cup that is already full. You cannot receive new relationship while clinging to old patterns of relating. And so it empties the cup. It clears the field. It creates the space in which something genuinely new can enter. This is the intelligence of the unconscious. This is the protection mechanism that feels like punish, immense but is actually profound care. The self loving you enough to remove what consciousness would have kept, to sever what consciousness would have maintained, to destroy what consciousness believed was necessary. And now, in this moment of recognition, you may find yourself reviewing your recent losses differently. That friend who disappeared, perhaps they were the mirror of your former self, and the psyche knew you could not evolve while their reflection remained. That family member who became critical, perhaps they loved you but could not bear your transformation, and the unconscious recognized the danger of their unconscious resistance. That person who demanded so much of your energy, perhaps they were the vampire, and the self knew that breakthrough required every ounce of vitality you possess. These were not random losses, these were necessary clearings, the psyche preparing the ground for something new to take root. And if you are in the loneliness now, if you are in the confusion of these removals, understand this. You are not being punished. You are being prepared. The breakthrough is close, closer than you realize, and these people had to go not because you failed them, but because your transformation cannot occur in their presence. Their energy signatures, their projections, their unconscious needs, these create a field that locks you into past patterns, and the future attempting to emerge requires a different field entirely. So the psyche creates that field, through removal, through withdrawal, through a loneliness that feels unbearable but is actually sacred, because in this loneliness, without the constant noise of others' needs and projections and resistances, you can finally hear the self. You can finally attend to the voice that has been trying to reach you through dreams, through symptoms, through that persistent sense that something must change. The unconscious has been speaking, but the volume of relationship drowned it out. Now, in the silence created by these removals, you can finally listen. And what you will hear, if you turn your attention inward rather than fixating on the losses, is instruction, guidance, the next step in your individuation. The psyche does not clear the field and then abandon you in it. It clears the field so it can finally communicate without interference, so it can show you directly what must happen next. The dream images become clearer, the intuitions become stronger, the sense of direction, which was muddled by conflicting voices and external demands, becomes precise. This is the gift hidden inside the apparent curse. This is the breakthrough concealed within the breakdown. But you must trust the process. You must resist the temptation to fill the emptiness immediately with new connections that replicate old patterns. You must resist the urge to chase after those who left, to convince them to return, to restore what the psyche worked so hard to remove. Because if you do that, if you override the unconscious clearing, you will delay your breakthrough indefinitely. You will remain in the in-between space, the threshold that feels unbearable precisely because it is meant to be passed through, not inhabited permanently. The loneliness is temporary, the breakthrough is permanent, but only if you allow the process to complete itself. The alchemists understood this principle. They knew that dissolution must precede coagulation, that the old form must completely break down before the new form can crystallize. What you are experiencing now is dissolution. Your old relational patterns, your old identity structures, your old ways of being in the world, all of this is dissolving, and it feels like death because it is death, the death of who you were. But death, in alchemical terms, is not the end. It is the necessary prerequisite for transformation. The seed must die before the tree can emerge. The caterpillar must dissolve before the butterfly can form. And you must endure this dissolution before your breakthrough can occur. You stand now in that sacred space between what was and what is becoming, and though it feels like abandonment, it is actually protection. The psyche has removed 3 types of people with surgical precision, the mirror of your former self, so you can become unrecognizable to who you were, the one who loved you but feared your transformation, so their unconscious resistance cannot sabotage your growth. The energy vampire, so the vitality required for breakthrough remains available for its true purpose. These removals were not cruel, they were necessary. They were the unconscious acting on your behalf, protecting what consciousness could not yet protect, clearing what consciousness would have kept. And now, in the silence, in the solitude, in this space that feels empty but is actually pregnant with possibility, now you can finally become not who others needed you to be, not who the collective approved of, not who your former relationships required, but who the self has been calling you to become all along. This is the breakthrough approaching. This is what the removals were preparing you for. And when it arrives, when the transformation completes itself, you will look back on this period of loss and recognize it differently, not as abandonment, but as initiation, not as punishment, but as protection, not as the end of connection, but as the clearing required for connections of a different order entirely. The people who belong in your life after breakthrough will recognize you as you are, not as you were. They will celebrate your transformation, not resist it. They will energize your continued growth, not drain the vitality it requires. But they could not enter while the old presences remained. The psyche knew this, and so it made space. painful space, sacred space, the space in which you are finally free to become yourself.